Welcome to episode 1 of the Raine podcast. What is inspiration? Inspiration is having the ability to come up with an interesting way to explain what inspiration is. That spark that tells you I could use a metaphor here or an iambic pentameter. And for those of you that are smart, you'll know that that's a poetic function and I'm not speaking in poem. And those of you that are even smarter will notice I'm not wearing glasses anymore. I never did and I never needed to. That's because I wanted to look smart to make you think I had valid things to say in this podcast. Plot twist, I do not. For those of you that didn't make sense for, which I understand is a lot, because it didn't make sense to me either, I'm going to go grab a dictionary. Here's what I made earlier. Inspiration. Noun. A sudden force or influence on a poet, artist or musician, etc. Stimulating creative activity, exalted thoughts, etc. Also, a person, principle, faith, is a source of stimulation to creative activity, such as, say, creative writing, which is what you're here for. Second definition is a sudden, brilliant, creative or timely idea. I had a brilliant, creative or timely idea to create this podcast. Doesn't seem so brilliant or creative now. The third definition is a drawing in of breath. Oh, look at me inspirate. So we're going to cover this in a basic way. Throughout the course of this podcast, we'll be using an example of the fantasy genre, which is my personal favourite genre to write, though I will be giving examples as to how you can apply the same logic to other genres. These other genres include things such as sci-fi, crime and romance, though admittedly I don't know too much about the latter and I will not elaborate on that. I view inspiration as the ability to create. If you have inspiration, you can create things. And when you're not inspired, you have, in our case, what's called a writer's block. And I would know a lot about that because I'm sitting here making a vodcast instead of writing. Fantasy, though it leaves so much room for creativity, often goes off the same very basic concepts. The Tolkien races, for example, though they might not necessarily be the first time they've appeared in literature, are often used as a basis for fantasy worlds, having elves, dwarves, humans, and other races such as orcs living together. In fact, this is so prevalent in fantasy that Tolkien's own race, the Hobbits, were brought into Dungeons and Dragons only to be renamed to what is now known as the Halflings. That also brings me on to my next point. Dungeons and Dragons is an excellent way to inspire yourself to write fantasy. I play Dungeons and Dragons nearly twice a week, sometimes more. This gives me a plethora of worlds, characters, and plot points to work on. I can create a story based on Dungeons and Dragons. Just a 3-hour play session and I wrote all of this. It doesn't seem like a lot, but Dungeons & Dragons doesn't tend to last for just one play session. In fact, a whole campaign can last a few months, even years. And that's how you can create a world. It's especially good when you're using your own world in the Dungeons & Dragons game. Then you're not using the official settings, which means that you can be more creative with the material. But as I said, Dungeons & Dragons is an excellent inspiration for fantasy writing. The camera may have moved a bit, but that's because I'm an idiot who forgot to charge my phone. Dungeons & Dragons is one of my personal favourite ways of developing a fantasy world in my head, and it works for a lot of others too, though not for everyone, as it is very time consuming and sometimes even money consuming. But not to worry, because there are podcasts such as Critical Role and Just Roll With It, which are very popular Dungeons & Dragons playing podcasts, where you can watch others play, and though they might not be your characters or your world, you can get the idea of how you create these kind of areas and people. That's the beauty of fantasy. You create it, even if it's not necessarily yours. A lot of fantasy is reused, restyled, reshaped into what the writer wants. You just need to take one look at the previously aforementioned transition from hobbits to halflings in Dungeons and Dragons, to see how things are repeated. So, how do you get inspired for these things? Read books. Read the original Game of Thrones books. Read Lord of the Rings books. Read The Hobbit. Read any fantasy book, depending on your taste. Because something to your taste, of course, you will write better. Watch films and TV shows too. The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings films were all excellent. Watch the Game of Thrones TV show. I haven't watched that, but I've heard it's good. Why not? Go ahead. It's there. Watch it. You can get inspiration from anywhere in fantasy. Any work of fantasy can be inspiration for your own. And there is surprising acceptance for similarities between fantasy worlds. And that familiarity, as well as the creativity, is what makes fantasy so great. Now, how does this apply to other genres? I said I was going to link them into other genres, so what am I going to do to link this in? Sci-fi. Sci-fi, science fiction, as you all presumably know. We can break that down. Science and fiction. How do you get inspiration for each of these? How do you get science inspiration? Simple. Research. Look at research papers. Look at something that interests you. It's harder to write about some boring science that you don't care about than it is to write about something that genuinely interests you. And sure, science fiction might not be for you, so maybe don't go down the science route. But that brings me quickly to the fiction route. The fiction route, on the other hand, is where things like Star Trek and Star Wars come from. It's where the mind goes wild. It lets you create whatever you want outside of the boundaries of science. You create your own science. And that's the beauty of it. You know, we can't have a USS Enterprise. We can't have a Millennium Falcon, but in those worlds they can. That's their fictional science. Science fiction. So inspiration for science fiction can either come from two places. From your mind, something new and original, or from some of the best minds on the planet. Okay. So you've worked out how to be inspired for science fiction, but how do you get that down on paper? The importance here is to remember. Make sure to write anything down. Any moment you have a burst of inspiration, get it down. Get a notepad, buy a notepad, carry the notepad, write it down when you have an idea. So moving on. The next genre I said we were going to talk about is crime, and that generally falls under thriller, but I'm focusing on crime here. Crime is important to note, because its inspiration can be very different to sci-fi, and at sci-fi you either take the science, which is proven, or you create your own science. Crime is within the bounds of law. It's very rare that you find something that is outside this world in the crime section. I'm not saying you can't have a sci-fi crime story. It could be very interesting. If you do write anything after watching one of these, I'd be happy to read all of them. What I'm trying to say is, crime tends to be set on Earth, modern day. And for that, you're going to need to do your research into the lore of the setting of your writing. We'll cover setting later in the podcast. All you need to know is what is related to the crime that is committed in your crime story. And then comes the getting of crime onto paper. Again, slightly different. You want your crime story to be within the bounds of believable and original. And those aren't necessarily the same thing, because believable things tend to be what happen every day. And that isn't original, because it happens every day. So that's why you need to find that midpoint. And if you go too original, what you'll tend to find is that your crime stories are so far-fetched that no one gets invested in them. You want your reader to think that this could happen to them, or their next door neighbour. That's the important part of crime. And that applies to crime in real life as well. It could happen to anybody. You hear that phrase so often, and you probably overlook it a lot, but it could happen to anybody, and you want to give that feeling in your writing. The next genre that I said I'd cover, or at least try to, is romance. You want to find another kind of midpoint like you did with the crime story, between super convenient scenarios where the protagonist falls onto the love interest's lap when the bus turns a corner, to mundane, boring build-up relationship. Like people, that I'm not saying, sorry, no. With romance, you want to find that midpoint, just like you did with crime. That midpoint between With romance, you tend to want to find another midpoint, kind of like you did with crime. This time, it's between the mundane, where the relationship slowly built up with no thrill. You want to have some thrill in a romance novel, of course, but you don't want too much. When it becomes too far-fetched, when everything seems too convenient, or, for that matter, too inconvenient for the protagonist to get the love interest, and then it still works out at the end. And that's where you find the midpoint between those two, where it's not completely ridiculously made up and unlikely to happen, but it's also not what is the norm. Something that stands out, something that will hook a reader in. You can take all that from your own experiences or even someone else's experience. That's up to you. I personally don't write romance as much. I tend to try and import some romance into some other genres just to kind of create inter-character connections, and characters, again, something else we will cover. But the inter-character connections are something that you need to build with your characters. We'll get to that eventually. I don't have too much to say about the romance genre, so I'll be swiftly moving on. Also helps if you have an active love life. Did tend to find that helps. Following episodes are going to be a bit longer, but this one's going to end here. That's because I'm flying solo and still kind of testing the waters in terms of what kind of content you guys want to see. But before you go, there's a section of this video that will come at the end of each episode, and the end of the series will have something to work with. This is where I'm going to create a story from scratch starting today, and by the end of this podcast I will demonstrate how what I've told you can be used to create something. So today, of course, we'll look at the inspiration for what I'm about to create over the series of these episodes. We'll stick with fantasy because that's my preferred genre, and we'll use some very basic elements from Tolkien's world and Dungeons and Dragons, my two main sources of inspiration for fantasy, and we'll bring them together to create a world of our own. So this story is going to take inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons and a campaign I recently played, which just ended yesterday, where I played a character named Piran, who was a minor god of the Forge. Now, that might not apply in my fantasy world, but I've got the basis for a character there, which I'm bringing to a new world, which I'm creating, and I'm being inspired to create now by Tolkien's world, as I don't want to use the direct world that we used in the Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Of course, I'm not going to rip off Middle-earth either. I'm going to create my own world, and I'm going to pick and choose the races that I want to be there. This is going to be a world with humans, elves, dwarves, orcs and goblins, and we may also throw in a few more from Dungeons and Dragons at a later stage, next episode, when we look at world building. But right now, we've been inspired by Tolkien with his races and the content of a Dungeons and Dragons campaign I've personally played in to create the basis of a story that I will be working on throughout this series. But that's all for today. Join me next week when I talk with my first guest about the concept of world building and settings, and how you can use those to be as creative as your whim desires. That's all for tonight. I'm Raine. Thank you for watching.